All right, let's jump right into today's explainer. We're looking directly at the SASB standards, specifically the 2023 Sustainability Accounting Standard for Solar Technology and Project Developers. We're going to unpack a super critical section of this framework today, the ecological impacts of project development. It's basically the industry's playbook for how to measure that incredibly delicate balance between building massive utility-scale solar projects and actually protecting local biodiversity. So here's a question for you. Is solar energy actually 100% green? Well, it's a bit of a provocative question, isn't it? Because when we think of solar, our brains immediately go to green. We picture clean, renewable energy that's absolutely crucial for getting us off of fossil fuels. But if you look at the physical reality of these massive utility-scale solar parks, it gets kinda complicated. Is large-scale solar development inherently good for local nature in every single instance? That's exactly the core tension we're diving into today.
Okay, so here's our roadmap. First, we'll look at the green paradox, then the disruption of natural habitats, followed by the cost of delays. After that, we'll cover local community opposition, assessing to protect, and finally, sustainable solar development. Let's get into it.
Starting with Section 1, the green paradox.
You know, the dual reality of solar development is really striking. On one side of the coin, we have these undeniable global benefits. I mean, we desperately need to reduce greenhouse gases, and solar is a total game changer for that. But we've also got to look at the local impacts. Dropping a giant utility-scale solar installation into an ecologically sensitive area, that inevitably changes the land use, and it can seriously disrupt the wildlife habitats that already exist there.
Which leads us to Section 2, disrupting natural habitats. Project developers absolutely have to account for direct physical threats to the environment. According to the SASB guidelines, these impacts include major land use changes and a really severe risk of habitat disruption. But it goes a lot further than just that. You've got to consider water consumption, which is huge, especially in arid regions where solar just makes the most sense. Then there's the risk of wildlife fatalities, maybe from the infrastructure itself or from displacing nesting grounds. Oh, and let's not forget the construction phase itself. Moving tons of earth causes major soil erosion, and introducing heavy machinery into fragile ecosystems is a massive deal. If these aren't managed right, they become very real threats to endangered species.
And that brings us to Section 3, the cost of delays. So this brings us to a really crucial accounting metric in the standard. It's called RRC 160A.1. Basically, this metric asks companies to report the total number and the aggregate duration in days of site shutdowns or project delays that are related to ecological impacts. Why track this so closely? Because ignoring environmental regulations has massive financial and temporal costs. Like, if a developer breaks local wildlife laws protecting endangered species, or if their construction contaminates groundwater, well, regulators can step in and completely halt the project. We're talking about hundreds of days of delays here. Lost revenues, skyrocketing costs, all because the ecological risks just weren't respected.
Moving on to Section 4, local community opposition.
Imagine for a second that a massive industrial project is moving into a nature reserve right down the road from your house. Naturally, that environmental footprint is going to trigger some local pushback, right? The SASB standard actually requires companies to outline exactly how they address community impacts. We're talking about totally valid concerns here, things like property valuation, visual aesthetics, or, literally just how the landscape is going to look. Plus, there's noise, congestion from all the construction trucks, and general human safety. When local governments and communities push back over land use footprints or water resource concerns, it can stall a development process just as fast as a regulatory shutdown.
Which takes us to Section 5, assess to protect. So how do developers avoid all this?
Well, successful project development really hinges on proactive assessment. The SASB standards specifically highlight something called a social impact assessment, or an SIA. An SIA is basically a formal process to evaluate, manage, and mitigate both community and ecological risks way before a single solar panel ever gets installed. Think of it as the critical bridge between our super ambitious clean energy goals and the absolute necessity of preserving local ecosystems. It's exactly how developers prove they're actually listening and adapting. Let's look at how this actually translates into practical action on the ground. When an SIA is done right, it literally shapes the physical layout of the solar park. First, environmental engineers are out there physically surveying the terrain for sensitive habitats. Second, they map out the specific zones where endangered species live or breed. And third, and honestly, this is where the magic happens, they use all that data to actually reorient the installation of the solar arrays. They take the blueprint and they change it, just completely avoiding those sensitive natural zones.
It's all about preserving the biodiversity while still capturing that essential solar energy. Finally, Section 6, Sustainable Solar Development. At the end of the day, true sustainable solar development isn't just about the technology itself, it's really about the process. The source material makes it very clear developers must proactively collaborate with communities. They need to engage stakeholders early on, build consensus, and actively work to create real benefits for the locals through these projects. On top of that, they have to leverage new and emerging tech to shrink their ecological footprint even further. Because the reality is, companies that have robust strategies for environmental impact assessment are the ones that drastically reduce the risk of those costly delays, and they're the ones setting themselves up for long-term success. Which leaves us with this final, really vital question. How do we balance our urgent need for clean energy with the equally urgent need to protect our fragile local ecosystems? As we've seen throughout this explainer, the data shows us it's not an either-or scenario. It's a necessary integration. We absolutely need solar energy, for sure, but we have to build it with a profound respect for the land and the life that already exists there. I really hope this deep dive into the SASB framework sparked your curiosity and gave you a fresh perspective on what it actually takes to build a sustainable future. Thanks for joining me today.